all the parks in Alaska that are just enormous. So the other reason for mapping vegetation is that the vegetation, the plants in Grand Canyon themselves are really, really diverse. This is an incredibly diverse park. In fact, we have more documented records of species in Grand Canyon than in any other NPS unit. I think it's up around 1,600, 1,700 species, something like that. There's a number of reasons why this is so. The first of these is that the park is huge. We're about 1.25 million acres of land, and everybody knows that if you sample more area, you find more plants. We have so much more opportunity to find different plants in the park just based on the size of the place. The second source of diversity in the park is this amazing elevational gradient that we have. Back in the 1890s, C. Hartnerium solidified the idea that if you have an elevational gradient going up in elevation, it's the same as moving north in latitude. He wasn't the first to come up with the idea, but he's the only one who had a mountain in his backyard, the one right behind town, to make his point with. But you can see here as you move up from 3,000 feet up to 12,000, 13,000 feet, you go through zones that he named after geographic areas. So we're going from the lower Sonoran, the lowest elevations, up to the Hudsonian, the Hudson Bay type of vegetation, very, very far north types of vegetation. If you look at the park, he was working down here at the San Francisco Peaks. Grand Canyon, the lowest point is around 1,200 feet. Down at Lake Mead, the highest point is about 8,800 feet up on the North Rim. The rule of thumb is that if you're trying to equate elevation and latitude, 1,000 feet of elevation represents about 2.9 degrees of north latitude. So here we have 7,600 feet of elevation, which is the equivalent, more or less, of 23 degrees north latitude. I'm not here to oohs and ahs. Thank you. That's right. That's the equivalent. I have to do this. That's the equivalent. If you start out in New Orleans, which is the home of Mardi Gras, and travel 23 degrees north latitude, you end up in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is the home of the RCMP. They have their training area there. They have very different vegetation and really, really different parades. More appropriately, it's thinking about going from Yuma, Arizona, driving north and ending up in Slave Lake, Alberta. Slave Lake, Alberta. It's a long way. This is 1,900 miles of driving, according to MapQuest. And what's amazing to me is not that we have that great a diversity of climate in the park. It's that 1,900 miles is squished into just a couple dozen miles in the canyon. I mean, you talk about traveling from Phantom Ranch, going up over the North Rim, find the 8,800 foot elevation mark, and you really haven't traveled more than 20 or 30 miles as the crow flies. So not only do we have this diversity, but this diversity is squished down. The plants are forced together in ways that you aren't going to find anywhere else in the world. So it's likely that we're going to be finding interesting combinations of plants. The third source of diversity is the collision of these regional floras. This is Steve McLaughlin's map of the floristic provinces. These are areas of similar vegetation types, similar floras. This is Flagstaff, so Grand Canyon sits up here in the Colorado Plateau, but it's very close in contacts, has influences from several different floristic provinces. Another way to look at this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's biotic community maps. And there's a lot going on here, but basically know that things in red and shades of pink here are elements from the Sonoran and Mojave deserts, In green, various shades of green are communities that have affinities with the Colorado Plateau, and these blue areas here and here are areas influenced by the Rocky Mountain flora. So you've also got some plains, grasses, and other species. So basically Grand Canyon is at the center of a lot of different colliding floras. So you'd expect that we're going to have some pretty diverse vegetation types by the time that we're done. So we map vegetation because it's required. We map vegetation because we've got a cool set of plants. We also have a number of information needs that will be met by the vegetation mapping project. The first of these is fire. There's nothing that warms the heart of a geologist or an archaeologist as much as burning vegetation. The only people who like it more are the fire guys who set fire to national parks and don't go to jail for it. This is the fire up on the Walhalla Plateau last year. It's important to know where you are because fire is very common in the forests of northern Arizona. And if you're trying to manage vegetation, you need to know what was there and what will be there. We also have information needs for fire models. The Fire and Aviation have a number of fairly sophisticated models for predicting fire behavior. So when there is an ignition, there is a start, they need to know what's going to happen. And in order to know that, they've got to get information on what the vegetation is structured like. Where are the fuels? Is it open and grassy, or is it dense and heavily loaded with fuels? Another information need we have that's going to be met by this vegetation map is wildlife habitat questions. We have a number of important and sensitive species in the park, and it's important to know where you're likely to find habitat for them, and exotic plant species as well. One of the things that this project is going to create for us is a map of which communities have been affected by exotics like cheatgrass and sow thistle, and which ones are relatively untouched. Give us some idea of how to manage, those different communities. So it's cool, it's required, and we have information needs. You would think that we had done this before, and in fact we have. There have been two sort of comprehensive park-wide vegetation maps done before. The first of these was a vegetation type map done in 1935 headed up by Claude Wagner. It was a type of mapping that was popularized in California in the forests. It was mostly concerned with forested areas, but it could be applied to shrubby and grassy areas as well. This is Claude Wagner and his crew. These are the data sheets. They basically collected information about what was the dominant plant in each 2.5 by 2.5 yard square in a 1 chain by half a chain rectangle. And it's actually pretty interesting stuff. The map they produced was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. This picture just doesn't do it justice. These are hand-tinted and hand-drawn, really fascinating. They were aimed at rating fire hazards and planning for disease control. So it's more of a forest type approach to mapping. If you get down towards the 4th and 5th purposes, you get lower down in the hierarchy here. You're looking at augmenting the flora and inventory of what's in the forests. The second map, that's a picture of Claude Wagner. He showed up at the South Rim. He was brought there by his daughter a few years back to do an oral history about this map. Last October, he celebrated his 99th birthday. I can only hope that happens to all vegetation mappers. The second map, comprehensive map, came about 40 years later. A group from the Arid Lands Research Program at the U of A, headed by Karen Reichert and Peter Warren, produced a vegetation map that was based on sampling done in a slightly different way, a little more like what we're trying to do, where you try and create models based on a lot of physical variables. You collect a lot of vegetation data, height, cover, and they use prominence class as a measure of dominance. But they were out there in the late 70s. You can tell that because we have cut-off jeans, and we're not wearing a shirt, and Brian Brown's hairdo is a dead giveaway.